All right, everyone. My clock says 3 o'clock, so we're going to get started. A little housekeeping. We have set aside 30 minutes today for this webinar, so we're going to move pretty fast. Gary and I can both be fast talkers, especially me. But if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We will do our best to address those at the end of the webinar. If we don't have time, we can make sure to follow up with you after the fact. We are happy to do that. So today we're going to be looking at what we learned through a series of integrations, actually with a new technology offering from our friends at Effisoft called Semantic Invoice. So to give us a little context about what exactly Semantic Invoice is to ground us for the webinar, I'm going to just show you that really quick. I'm going to switch my screen here. And of course I've timed out, so let me go ahead and log in. So Semantic Invoice is essentially capture as a service. So its really intent is to be able to eliminate or at least greatly reduce the manual data entry that's associated with invoice processing. So this application, unlike some other systems that you may have seen out there, uses an AI-driven approach. So other systems might have varying degrees of configuration or development that you have to do in order to be able to actually get it to know about the invoices that you deal with in your business. This system comes just super smart out of the box, completely plug and play. It essentially understands any invoice format that you throw at it. And really configuration of the system itself, I'll actually show it to you here, is really just a matter of, hey, which are those fields that I actually want to pull out? So what are the things I normally would have to type? Instead of typing, what are the fields that the system's going to automatically extract for me? And that can be both header information, which I'll show you kind of more of what I mean about that in a second, as well as any of the actual line items that are in that invoice. So real quick, I'll just show you how this works. I'm going to pretend I'm an operator here, and I'm going to claim some invoices to process. Now, usually, if everything goes well, these would just be released and they would go straight into whatever system I needed them to go into. But that doesn't make for a very interesting demo. So if you notice that on that configuration screen, I'd set the confidence threshold really high. Effisoft works on a exception-based processing concept, which is to say it's only going to show you as an operator, ask you to look at things that it's not highly confident that it got correct. And so as it extracted the information from this invoice that I have up here, there's a couple of fields that it wasn't quite confident in, so I had the system stop us so that we could take a look at that. But first, just will give you a little tour. So it pulled 4 invoices that needed some review, so I can see those here on the left-hand side of my screen. Here I see a preview of the actual invoice. And then here on the right-hand side, here's where I see that data that's actually been extracted from the invoice. And so if I click through some of these, you can see where it's grabbing the PO number or the invoice date or the due date. It also is pulling all the vendor information. A cool thing about this is it can actually pull this information directly off the invoice, or it can do a lookup in, like, if you have like a vendor database that we need to pull that information from. Maybe it needs to add different information like the vendor ID that may not appear on an invoice. We can pull that information as well. Here's some that it wasn't quite confident in. Notice that it jumped to page 4 of the invoice. So this was actually a multi-page invoice, and that tax rate was not on the first page. So even though I said header data, it actually can appear anywhere on the invoice. And then kind of maybe most interesting to people, if you can imagine, if you had all of these tables of data that you had to enter, doing data entry on that can take a really long time. And so this system actually is able to automatically extract all those, what we call line item details as well. So if I click down here, you can actually see that it has extracted all of this tabular data too. And I can click through that, and it actually has done that for all of the pages of this invoice. So this is the application that's going to ground us that we're going to be talking about integrating today. And so you might be saying, that's great, Lisa. I can see how that would save me some time for doing all that data entry, but I actually need that information not in Semantic Invoice, but I actually need it in my financial system. And so that's kind of where we're going to pick off. And I'm going to kick it off to Gary. So Gary, we need more data in our financial system. What do we do?
Yeah, I'm going to take over the screen real quick and then we'll go. the first thing you'd want to do is really look to see if you have an existing integration. Is there an out-of-box integration that you can utilize? Now, one of the cool things with the semantic tool is that there is one. They do provide an integration with Dynamics, Microsoft Dynamics for financial system. And that is already available to set up in the Microsoft suite. And we have a quick integration example. I'm going to show just what Lisa's invoice would look like once it gets over to Dynamics. And so we had Cord Industries. Once she processed it and released it, the data can get sent over to Microsoft Dynamics. And I can show you here. This is a very busy screen, but I can go over into vendor invoices here and actually look for pending invoices and see that this data came over from Cord Industries. And here's our number, invoice number. If I click in, I can actually get more information about the invoice. And we're not passing a lot of data for this example, but we are passing the invoice number, and we are also passing the invoice date and the due date. We can pass multiple fields here, but this is kind of the example data we're sending over for this. So that's pretty cool, and it's available. Again, if you're using Dynamics, it's straightforward to set up. It's an integration that already exists.
Yeah. So the problem is that sometimes folks are not so lucky. So if you are not using Microsoft Dynamics, what are you supposed to do then?
Right. Yeah. If you don't have that built for you out of the box, what are you going to do? And the old way to do this, or the kind of the long, still a lot of people go this method, is to create your own integration and basically end up designing, developing, and maintaining integration code to deal with this. And you might leverage an API like a SOAP API or a REST API. In this case, Semantic doesn't have a REST API, but it does support webhook integration. And
now I want to interject there really quick. It doesn't have a REST API yet, Gary, but it is coming on the roadmap very soon. Right. And one of the cool things about this is a true SaaS application. And so actually, like every couple of weeks, I log in again and there's new functionality available. So we can actually see that the REST API is actually coming.
Yeah, it actually is funny. Lisa and I will talk to each other and say, hey, what is this new thing that has appeared? Because they are actually developing it in an agile way where they're adding features all the time. It's really been fun to watch it grow. But they do already have a webhook integration. And you might ask, well, what's a webhook? And it basically is a reverse API where you provide a URL to the Effisoft system. And instead of having to pull and look for invoices, Effisoft will notify that URL that a new invoice has arrived. So Effisoft calls the webhook, and the logic behind that will run and pass the data to your integrated systems. Now, there are a lot of ways you might have implemented this. For this talk today, we just did a straightforward example using AWS. And in this case, we set up an API gateway in AWS and backed it with a Lambda function. So basically a serverless solution. Now this is our gateway here. And so we set up a URL that we can then attach to Effisoft. And this gets called, and you can see we're listening for a post. And over here, we're calling a Lambda function. And so this is the setup for the Lambda function. It's pretty straightforward, and then to be fair, this is a pretty straightforward and simple example. We're just going to send information over to Slack. But I'm going to show you what happens when we do this. Let me jump over to Semantic. And so Lisa had showed this section where we're processing invoices. I'm going to go over to the settings, and she featured this screen briefly. But if you go into export, you can see that you can create multiple integrations. And these are all webhook integrations. And so once it loads up, I've been obviously having fun here. I've created quite a few, and we're going to show most of these today. So here's AWS Lambda here. The nice thing is, so one way to test this, right, would be to send invoices through and wait for them to get processed and see what happens, right? Well, that's a little bit tedious, right? It's not really a quick way to evaluate the data getting sent out from your system. Effisoft provides an example payload where you just hit test, and it actually will call out to the webhook. And so you can quickly hit test, and then it should go. It says it connected, so it's hit the gateway. And in theory, and I will actually show you before I jump over, the data we're passing is very simple for this Slack message. We're just passing the vendor name, the invoice number, and the due date. So we jump over to Slack, we should have a message, and you can see it has arrived here. Nothing like doing a live demo, right? It's always exciting to see if it actually gets through, but it did. We can see the Lambda test is the name of my function. Here's the vendor, the invoice number. And I could have passed more data. It actually, this integration will take as much data as I want to send it, but this is just an example. Now, so in this case, you really have to have implemented your own code and set up the web API And once you've done that, then you're responsible basically for developing the backend, whether it's in Node.js or Python or Java or whatever. But it's kind of a common way to do this integration, and it does work, and it's really straightforward to set up.
And we've been, Gary and I have been doing this a lot of years, and we have a whole business that where we're developing these custom integrations for our clients. But honestly, if I were a business owner and putting something like this, like a SaaS application into my ecosystem, the idea of having to actually create my own middleware application and then maintain that just kind of sucks, if I'm perfectly honest. So, and I'm not the only one who's thought this way. And in fact, kind of a whole little, a new application space has popped up in recent years to really address this gap. And it's actually often termed integration platform as a service, or iPaaS solutions. So these tools would provide no code or low code frameworks for actually integrating and creating these automations across multiple technologies in your ecosystem. And so in fact, that first integration that we showed you, that one that went to Microsoft Dynamics, actually was built on top of one of these frameworks, the Microsoft Power Platform using Power Automate. So I'm going to ask Gary to kind of crack open the hood of that integration and start to show us kind of exactly how these platforms work.
Yeah, Lisa showed you the beginning and I showed you the end, but we didn't get to the middle, which is what we're going to show now. And this is an integration tool called Power Automate. And I'm going to bring it up now on the screen. This is the sort of the front screen. If I go into edit, you can see the tool here. And Effisoft has actually created a connector that you can use out of the box to add to the beginning of your workflow. And when you add this, the nice thing is Effisoft behind the scenes will automatically create the webhook in the semantic system. And then once this has been connected, you can actually set up the additional steps in your workflow that you want. Now we're doing a pretty simplistic flow again. This is sort of a reference flow provided by Effisoft, but it will send an email notification, stash the PDF file on OneDrive, and then create the record, which we saw at the end of that flow in Dynamics. So again, I'm going to run through this real quick. I'm going to do all of these kind of live so we can kind of see them run. If I hit test over here, so it's done. It's successfully sent the message. One thing about Power Automate is you can kind of see that it when it's running, that there is a task in place. Notice the failed ones that you can actually see the logs. I'll jump into one of these. If I keep sending the same invoice ID over and over again, it will actually complain because it's basically a duplicate record in the dynamic system. And so this is where it failed before, and it said it already existed. Let me go back here, and you can see it succeeded. Now, while Lisa was talking a little bit, I went in and deleted my invoice so that hopefully I can recreate it here just to show an example. And now it's back. And so the flow has run and we've created the invoice here. But you can see now, so before when I showed you the Lambda and the API gateway, to see the implementation of the logic, you're going to have to really look at the Python code and understand what it's doing, right? With this kind of a workflow automation tool, you can actually, at a high level at least, see each of the steps along the process and what system it's talking to. And so that is pretty cool. It gives you a way to sort of, at a high level, understand what needs to happen in this flow. It lets you quickly wire together things. And plus, standard blocks, provide a starting point for many types of integrations.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you happen to be invested in the Power Platform, you're probably should take a look at using something like Power Automate, see what it can do for you. But it's actually not the only option that's out there. So we're going to use the rest of our time today to talk you through some other options that we encounter quite frequently. And the first one that we're going to go over is one that I think kind of gets a lot of use because it has super low cost point, like initial implementation. So as you're just getting started, when you're just a person in your BU trying to just make something a little easier to do, it can be really low cost to get into your infrastructure. And that's a tool called Zapier.
Yeah, so this was a fun exercise because we got to do basically 4 different ways to export data. And so Zapier is the next one we took a look at. And it's similar in this sort of a concept where you're going to put together blocks. If you go into your screen, you can create a Zap. and you can immediately, it'll ask you, what do you want to trigger off of? And that action can be an event from an application. It can be a scheduled timer, or it can be a webhook. And this is what we use for our example. We used a webhook integration. But just getting started here, you can see there are a ton of applications available just out of the box where you can do your integration. Let me show the webhook, and then I'm going to jump back to our actual flow. When you do a webhook, you can actually listen for an event, either just the payload, which is like the JSON that's sent over, or you can do a raw hook where you get all the data, including all the headers, which could be useful if you need to inspect the header information. And then once you do that, you just add to the actions and build your workflow. And an action can be an integration with another system, or it could be a conditional statement. Maybe you want to filter something, or maybe you want to run 2 different paths, and maybe you want to stop the process of the flow if something happens, right? And so those are all possible. Now I'm going to show you what we made just as an example. It's over here. So we decided to kind of do a straightforward integration here where I'm getting the hook. Now, one thing I want to mention here, I'm going to back up just a little bit. Notice there's not a Effisoft, dedicated hook here, right? There's not a dedicated Effisoft integration in either this one or Workato for that matter. But you don't need that because a webhook is a webhook, right? And so just using the standard block here, I'm able to start my flow and add it as a listener to Effisoft, and I can run. Now we are connecting to sort of standard applications that exist within the ecosystem of Zapier. They have a Slack integration. We do a lot of Slack and email in this demo, but it's good to demo because you can see stuff going through. And then we wanted to say, well, what if we want to put it in a backend ECM system? And so in this case, we're deciding we're going to upload it to Box. So let me go ahead, and I want to open this real quick also just to show this is what the inside kind of looks like. Notice the data that comes in. We're able to say, hey, link the URL and send the file name over to Box, right? This has an interesting, like a nice test suite where you can reuse data or you can run a retest. Now, being able to reuse data is nice because then you can actually just use the one test and not having to keep sending tests over from Effisoft. So I wanted to show that real quick. But let me run this one. And again, I'm just using the test button here. And so it's fine.
This is something that I think is really nice about these sorts of platforms, because you can imagine all the time that it can take, and when you're doing development, rapid development, and having to go through all these test cycles, having like the ability to just like quickly like submit another payload is just, I don't know, to me that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I'll show the Workato one as well. And one of the things I enjoyed about that one was you can go to test mode and you can edit your scripts and then reuse that test data over and over again while you're editing your scripts. And that was really cool. It just saves a lot of time, right? You don't have to, let's say Effisoft didn't have a test button and I had to send invoices through over and over again. That would really slow me down. So being able to grab a payload and store it as test data is awesome. And Zapier and Workato both provide ways to do that. So over in Slack, I actually, in this case, decided to send the actual file versus just sending a link. But you can see I have the core industries, the due date, and basically the PDF itself. We can actually look at the invoice. Now that was the first step. Let me go back to the next step should have been sending over to Box. So let me go look at Box. And I made a semantic folder, which is my destination. Let me see if it showed up. So you can see this actually has arrived. So not only the notification went through, but all that data was passed along the workflow and is available to send along to Box. So here we go here, and we can see the invoice. So all these solutions, you're able to, especially when there's an existing integration, you can stand something up in just a couple of hours to prototype it and get it working. None of these were a major amount of work to get started. And that framework, all this framework goodness, right, all these blocks and everything is already done for you with these iPaaS systems. And when you have a connector in place, it makes it even easier. And again, as you can see, Zapier makes the data available from step to step to step. So every system that you need to talk to has the data that came in from the webhook.
Yeah. So commercially, Zapier really works on, they have different tiers of pricing based on like a per Zap basis. So I mentioned this can be really great as you're getting started. However, when we're looking at really more big enterprise type installations, we typically find that maybe another solution that's one of our favorites is a better fit. And so an option that we like for these more enterprise solutions, Gary's alluded to a couple of times already, is one called Workato.
Yeah, and this demo, this is where I'm going to do some juggling of machetes and flaming torches, because we're going to do a live, start working on a live recipe here. And so one of the really cool things that when I started working with this was I was able to like quickly set up the webhook. And if you see here, let me just back up a little bit on this and say, again, you can trigger from an app with Workato, you can run on a schedule, you can manage other recipes and do all sorts of stuff. We're going to trigger from a webhook. And so if I start building it, I'm actually going to build this on the fly. One of the really neat things was it's a very intuitive interface to me, and I really enjoyed working with it. The guided setup made a lot of sense to me. If I go into guided setup, it's going to actually ask me to put an event name, and it's going to create the webhook URL. And then I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to hit next. And then it's going to sit here and wait. And I'm going to run over here really fast, hopefully, and drop this in. And then I'm going to hit test. And it worked. And I'm going to run over here. And it actually received the event and did a really nice job of putting out the payload, explaining everything. If I set up the webhook now, it actually creates a schema for me automatically, and all these variables are available. It was like, that took like, I mean, literally I did that on the fly, right? And so this part of it was super easy and very, very intuitive to me. And I was really excited about it. So we made our own recipe also. If I go into one quick note, you can also clone recipes. So I have a clone here to start from this recipe if I want to start working. So let me jump into here real quick. This one was a little different. So we went a little nuts on this one. We decided we're going to do a basic block integration, which is standard integration that they have with email. But then we wanted to talk to a system that didn't have a connector built in, right? Like not every application on the planet is going to have a built-in connector. And how hard is it to actually set that up? Well, we at Bluefish utilize an ECM system called mfiles, and it has a REST API. And I know it well enough to where I could put together a payload for this and then send it over and try to create a document. So instead of an integration with like Box or something, which Workato has that kind of available out of the box, we will actually make a custom call in this case. And we're going to basically do the steps with the mfiles API that you'd have to do to send in a file. In the world of mfiles, you need to upload the file to a temp space and then create an object and link the file. So we're going to do all that. Again, this hook is what I showed before. We added a little bit more flavor in here in that we actually wanted to inspect the data coming in and do something with that with a conditional. Now, one thing you'll notice, there's a little .2_i here. The data being passed over is text. And then I was like, well, I want to act on it numerically. Well, Workato provides a bunch of functions that allow you to convert data. And so I can see, like, if the invoice amount is over $1,000, send an email, hey, warning, this is over 1,000, it needs approval, right? And so I'm going to run this one. Let me start, the recipe is running, so jump over here. So it kicked off, and then I can come over here and go to jobs and see. So job received at 1:24 p.m. today, which is Pacific time, and it's waiting for new jobs. So I should have an email here, and I do. And so I'm able to construct the body of the email in Workato and then drop in variables as needed. If I click download invoice, there's a link that will take me to the invoice and download it. You can notice I put some data in here as well. Now that's the first step. What also should have happened is we should have gotten it, a document loaded up into mfiles. So I open up mfiles here. Just a super brief tour of mfiles. Mfiles is a dynamically driven kind of a metadata-based hierarchical system. And so rather than real folders, you can actually group things by metadata, which is really cool. And so I've created something of type invoice here. If I open that up, I can see all of my invoices. So there's one, which is, you know, not too many so far, but we just sent one test today. I click on cord invoice here. You can see not only did I create the document, but I also passed metadata to it, right? So the vendor name and the invoice number. And I could have gone crazy here and added as many properties as I really wanted to pass over. If I go to preview, it should generate a preview of the PDF itself. So really quick, I see we're coming toward the end of the half hour, but I want to show one more thing because it's really, I think it's really cool. First thing I want to show is this is what it looks like in the payload. So I know the structure of the JSON that mfiles expects because I work with the API. And if I put this in, all I had to do was drop in templates for the variables. And every time this runs, it'll automatically populate these fields and send the data over to mfiles. Now, really fast, I'm going to stop the recipe and I'm going to edit it and just show you. You can also test jobs with this as well. And I can repeat the job here, or I can run a test and it'll wait for data. So this is really powerful to me, and I found this really intuitive to develop. It was really the webhook thing was the one was like almost magic to me. It's like, oh wow, I didn't have to do anything. And literally, I just had to introspect the incoming payload, and it made all the variables, and I was done. It was very exciting to see that. So what I really like, it's a usable interface, good testing tool. It was super easy to listen for payload data and set it up. We demoed a bunch of simple flows here today, but there's a lot of complexity that we could actually do with Workato. We could have a whole, and Zapier, we could have whole talks dedicated just to that. One, in the interest of like, well, what is difficult here, right? All these applications have hundreds of built-in integrations, but if your integration doesn't exist, you can still use the generic connectors. Now, the one caveat here is you're going to need to know the API of your system. Like I needed to know what to send to mfiles to make it accept the data and create the content. That's still not really code, but it is understanding a REST API and understanding how to talk to the REST API. But what's really cool is like once you have one of these tools, you start setting up integrations. You basically have a framework that lets you create additional automations all over the place, all over your ecosystem. And you can clone recipes, and you can release the data in a whole stream of things. And then save the invoice into your content management system all at the same time.
Yeah, I think, as we're getting towards the end here, I think that's really the key takeaway. So what we're seeing in the industry is this need to be able to tap into information in all these different data silos, and letting the information in one system drive business processes in another system altogether. So integrations like this are going to just be key to digital transformation. And so having a framework in place that allows you to add these automations quickly without a huge development effort can really be a game changer. And Gary, we always heard that old adage that the best way to eat an elephant is the one bite at a time, right? I really think that the best way to tackle your digital transformation is one step at a time, one measurable, concrete step at a time. So, I showed you all at the beginning semantic invoice. I just, using a tool like that to add automation to something like invoice processing that every organization has to deal with can be a really great first step and can provide you with that quick return on your investment right away. And then once you have that momentum, you can continue to use these integration technologies to add more automations throughout your system. So I think we have 1 minute left. If anybody does have a burning question, please put it in the chat. But Gary, I have one question for you. So, now that we have this kind of prototype solution in place, if you were to want to take this to the next level, what would you do next to really make these integrations be ready for prime time and really production ready?
Yeah, it was really fun to work with these and set up the demos. It was really lightweight to do. There are some things that I would definitely do. Right now, we're basically using what I would call security through obscurity. The webhooks are open. Workato has a really cool feature where you can introspect the data coming over and not even fire the trigger if it doesn't meet the conditions. And there's a couple headers in the Effisoft payload that I could use as like a token, right? And so you wouldn't get any kind of random request coming through the trigger. The other thing is I would add more data validation, right, and conditional logic. And then there's all the whole scenarios of error handling.
Yeah.
We only had the sunny day scenario for the M files. We just assumed it got through. And I think that's sort of the next step, is dealing with all the edge cases where there's an error and exception and things like that. It was really, really cool, though, to develop the base demo system for all these platforms and to get them up and working and seeing the data flow into multiple systems. And so the next steps are definitely going to be those things.
Okay, cool. All right, I think we are out of time. Gary put up on the screen here his email address, and mine is there as well. So if you do have any other questions that come up, or if you're watching this on our recording so you couldn't ask us live, please reach out. We're happy to answer any questions about Semantic Invoice or any of these integrations that we talked about today. All right, thanks y'all. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.